This conference will now be recorded.
So hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for tuning in to the sixth webinar of our winter webinar series. My name is Vicky and I'm the coordinator of the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, and I'll be hosting today's webinar from Peterborough. Whether this is your first time joining an OIPC webinar or you're a return customer, welcome. Just a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. All of the attendees have been placed on mute to eliminate any excess background noise. And today's presentation will be about 40 minutes or so. And there will be time at the end for questions. So if you have any, just write them in the chat box below and we'll go through them at the end of the webinar. Also, be sure to check out some of our upcoming webinars on March the 27th and April 10th. There's only 2 left now. So today, Diana Moe will be discussing invasive species initiatives at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Diana is a program specialist for the invasive alien species section at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. At the CFIA, she is involved with the development and implementation of the invasive alien species program and the invasive plant program, and is the national technical lead for the Asian gypsy moth program. Welcome, Diana, and thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, of course, no problem.
And I'll just switch it over to you now.
Yep. Great.
Awesome.
Can you see my screen now? I think I've shared it.
Yep, I can see it.
Great. Not. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining. As Vicky mentioned, I'm with the CFIA, and I'll give you an overview today of the CFIA's invasive plant program and some of the things we're working on here at the CFIA. I'll just start off. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency is the federal agency responsible for the regulation of plant pests. Our name doesn't always reflect that, so I always like to tell people, what we do and how we fit in. Canada has a long history of regulating plant pests. However, a targeted invasive plant program was only formally established in 2011. The invasive plant policy is outlined in our directive, D1201, which outlines the phytosanitary requirements to prevent the introduction and spread of plants regulated as pests in Canada. And that's available online if you're interested in having a look at it. So to date, we have 18 species of plants and 3 genera of invasive plants that are currently listed on the regulated pest list for Canada. Our focus is on prevention. So the CFI generally regulates species which are not yet present in Canada. Our main mechanism of keeping things out is we prohibit the importation of things. However, there are a few species that are on our regulated pest list that are present in very limited distribution in Canada, and we have regulatory action being taken on those species. The regulated pest list is an evergreen list, so as new species are evaluated, if there are other pests that we find that meet the criteria for regulation, that list would be updated. So during this presentation, I'll provide you an update of the status of 3 regulated invasive plant species that have limited distribution in Canada. Those 3 species where action's being taken, I'll highlight some of the different approaches that we might take to controlling the species depending on the circumstances. I'll also give a brief introduction to how species are, how they're assessed for regulation, provide a preview of some plants that are being considered for regulation, and finally, I'll introduce a couple of other projects the invasive alien species section at the CFI is working on and that relate to invasive plants as well. So the first species that I thought I would highlight is kudzu. So this is a highly invasive vine native to Asia. It's aggressive, viney growth, smothers and eliminates native plants and shrub species. It was detected in Ontario in one location in 2009. Kudzu was added to the regulated pest list in 2015 for Canada. In the US, it infests approximately 3 million hectares and is described as one of the United States' most harmful non-Indigenous plants. In the US, there are some significant economic impacts that include impacts to the forestry sector, to hydro, to railways, parks, private homeowners, and agriculture. So the impacts are pretty widespread. In forestry in the US, they estimate that they have productivity losses valued at 100 to 500 million per year, with control costs at about 500 US per hectare per year. There's significant cost to power companies. They've been estimated to be about 1.5 million per year in the US. So in Canada, this is present in one location in Canada, and based on the impacts that the US had seen, we added this to the regulated pest list. It's not known to occur elsewhere in Canada beyond that one location in southern Ontario, and both the province of BC and the province of Ontario have also assessed this weed and added it to their Weed Control Act. So the photo that you see there in the bottom right-hand corner, that is the kudzu population in Ontario. You'll notice that it's a very steep slope there, and the kudzu actually is, it's quite dense on that location. So underneath, the slope is actually a lot steeper than it even looks in that photo. It's approaching 90 degrees at the top, and the site is really prone to erosion. So when we were looking at regulating the species and taking action on this, because of the nature of the site and because it's very difficult to work on, it's erosion prone, and if we had just ordered removal of the kudzu, it was felt that we might lose the cliff as well. Because of all these factors, the CFIA in the province of Ontario, both OMAFRA and OMNR, worked together to come up with a kudzu eradication plan. And we initiated this in 2015. The eradication began. It is a long-term, multi-phased plan. So we're looking at a 10-year project to get the kudzu removed from that area and to revegetate the site. So the removal of the kudzu is occurring both using physical removal and chemical control. So there's cutting of the kudzu vines, and there's chemical control occurring on the site. And there's also revegetation occurring. So directed plantings are happening on that site. The removal and revegetation is being completed in zones. It was felt that tackling the entire site at once would lead to greater erosion. So the revegetation is including a mix of both woody and herbaceous species to try and really stabilize the site there. The first phase of the plan has been completed with good control of the kudzu, and there's been some successful plantings. We're seeing both woody and herbaceous species successfully thriving at that site. And last year, there was also, in addition to the planted species becoming established, last year we saw some natural establishment occurring on the site. So in the bottom photo, you'll see that some equisetum that moved into one of the zones where kudzu was removed. So we're cautiously optimistic about the eradication plan and the work that's happening on that site. Year 5 of the project will commence this spring. So we'll continue to monitor that site and throughout the 10-year plan and beyond. Another species that is on the regulated pest list and is found in small isolated locations in Canada is jointed goat grass, Algalops cylindrica. This is an annual grass that was first detected in Canada in 2006. It's a grain contaminant, and an agricultural pest. So the pathway for it to get into Canada is likely through contaminant of grain. It's difficult to separate from cereals, particularly winter wheat. The seeds are very similar. So even during the cleaning process, jointed goat grass is often not removed. It has been detected in non-agricultural settings in Ontario, Quebec, and BC, near rail lines and facilities moving grain. There has been ongoing control with herbicides over the past several years to try and eradicate this pest from Canada. It has the ability to hybridize with wheat, and the main impacts would be felt in an agricultural setting. Canada is a big grain growing and a wheat producing country. So the economic impacts, if this were to become established in an agricultural setting, would be quite high. So we've been taking action on every location where this has been observed, and we've been seeing some very good success. In some areas, we've already been able to declare eradication. That's based on 5 years of negative survey results. So not finding the species present after 5 years of surveillance. And that's based on the biology of the plant. So the seed can remain viable for 5 years. So we have to keep surveying even for 5 years after we haven't found this present on a site. So this is one where we think we have some good success, but we'll continue to monitor the situation. And we also have ongoing surveillance at facilities that move grain and along rail corridors, because we know this is a likely pathway for jointed goat grass to get into Canada. The third species that I thought I would highlight during this talk is Rundle NonEx. This is a species that was added to the regulated pest list for Canada in February of 2018. So this is the most recent addition of an invasive plant to the regulated pest list. It is a perennial grass with strong fleshy rhizomes, and it's quite tall. The stems can be 2 to 10 meters tall. You can see a picture of it there in the bottom right-hand corner. This is a horticultural plant, and we did know that it had been in the horticultural trade when we looked at regulating this species. It has limited distribution within Canada. The environmental impacts of this plant, it's mainly environmental impacts. It's not an agricultural pest per se, but the main environmental impact is very similar to Phragmites. It can go into ditches and hydro corridors as well. It produces standing biomass that stays over the winter time. We know that it has overwintered in the Niagara Falls area and in the Vancouver area, and it's hardy to zone 6. So when we went out for consultation on whether we should regulate this species or not, we had strong support nationally to regulate this species. So it was added in 2018. So the way that we're controlling this is a little bit different, because we did know that it was in the horticultural pathway. We did know that some nurseries and greenhouses did have this plant in stock. So one of the control actions is actually export for those nurseries and greenhouses that had this. The U.S. does not regulate this species, so export to the United States was an option to get this plant out of Canada. For homeowners and for private areas that have this plant planted, then those are being ordered disposed of as we find them. So there have been some instances where notices to dispose have gone out. They're usually just 1 or 2 plants in a planting, and we work then with the homeowner to eradicate the plant from the property. And then, of course, we have our import controls in place, so there'll be no further importations of Rundle NonEx as of last year, February. when it was added to the regulated pest list. So how are new species assessed for Canada? How do we end up with invasive plants on the regulated pest list? So we do have a risk assessment unit within the CFIA. We have scientific advice right in-house, and there can be many triggers for an assessment. We could have our scientists going to conferences, scanning the academic literature, and hearing about a new plant that we maybe should be concerned about. Sometimes an import permit can trigger things. If it's a new species to Canada, somebody wants to bring it in, and we've never seen this plant before, and we know it's not in the environment, that can trigger a risk assessment. We may have issues raised by some of our federal, territorial, or provincial partners. They may see something or have heard of something, and then we will look at conducting a risk assessment. And there can be interceptions if we find something at the border that we know doesn't occur in Canada. We can do a categorization risk assessment and determine whether we should be concerned about that. Our risk assessments can be either done on a species level, or they can be done on a pathway level. So if we were looking at importing grain from a new country, a new area that we hadn't imported grain from before, we would conduct a pathway risk assessment and look at that grain in the area that it's coming from, and what are all the various invasive plants and invasive species beyond plants that could be carried in that grain. The same could be for imported bird seed. So that could be a combination of many grains, but birdseed could be a pathway for invasive plants to get into Canada. So if we're looking at importing from a new area that we haven't imported from before, what are the risks that may be carried there? It can also be done on a species-specific level. So something like forage kochia, which was proposed as a new crop for Canada. Does that species in and of itself have the capability to become invasive in Canada? So new species are evaluated in a tiered approach. So we ask some initial questions. So is this something that we should be concerned about? Is it already native or naturalized in Canada? Is it a common cultivated species? If the answer to either of those questions is yes, then we're not going to continue with a plant pest risk assessment. Is it a tropical species, so not likely to overwinter here? Again, if that were to be a yes, we would likely stop the risk assessment right there. If it can't survive here over winter, it's not something that we need to be concerned about. Is there evidence of weediness or invasiveness elsewhere in the world? That would be one of the initial questions that we would ask ourselves. We also have to look at things like the pathway of entry. If we have species with the ability to naturalize from the U.S. Via the wind or migratory bird populations, then those might not be as good a candidate for regulatory control, import control, as some other species. If after those initial questions we think there is still some concern, then we would go ahead with a full risk assessment process. So initially we would look at a categorization, looking for the potential to survive in Canada and the potential for some significant impact. And then we would conduct that full pest risk analysis, also looking at if we were to allow it to come in, what are the risk management options? So, something might be have the potential to be invasive, but we might have really good control options. So we need to balance those things. So for species that are proposed to be imported for economic purposes, horticulture, new crops, we need to balance in the assessment looking at the potential economic gains with potential impact. We'd review and assess the negative impact to the plant resource base, consider innovation and advancement of new alternative crops, look at how easily some of these things might be to manage. As I said, should we allow them to come in? And then once we've completed our full weed risk assessment. We would develop a risk management document that looks at the assessment, that balances the benefits and the concerns, and go out for public consultation. So the risk management documents are always put out for public consultation, and the feedback that we receive is really important as part of the decision-making process. When we go out with one of those risk management documents, we're putting out the best information that we have to date. But sometimes a lot of information isn't available on these species. They're usually not here yet. Some of them can be quite obscure, but there may be other people in Canada that have more information on these species. So when we go out for consultation, we really are looking for feedback, and we consider all the feedback that we receive quite carefully before we make a decision. I'll just give you a little snapshot of some of the invasive plant species that are being considered for regulation. They're not yet, we haven't made a determination on these species, but these are some of the species we're looking at. So what I've done here is I've chosen a snapshot of species for illustrative purposes. So there are many more species in addition to the species that are shown here. I've selected these ones as the horticultural pathway is the likely point of entry for these species, and I thought that might be of most interest to this group. There are many other invasive plants that may come to Canada in other pathways. I've mentioned, contaminants of crops. They may come in with soil, but I've chosen these ones as they're likely to come in through the horticultural pathway. So the species highlighted in green, those are species that are considered to be absent from Canada. We have no evidence that they're already here or being offered for sale. The yellow highlighted species, we have some limited evidence that these species might have been available in trade. The blue section, there's more information that these have been available in trade more often, and then the purple section at the bottom, we have evidence that these species have already been introduced into the Canadian environment, but they're not considered to be widely distributed. Something that I'll point out with this chart is you'll note that the zones here, they're not at all applicable to Ontario. So the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is responsible for protecting all of Canada. So we have to consider a broad range of climate zones. We might have some species that are only potentially invasive in the southern part of British Columbia. But if a species is not here yet, I mean, that's a valuable part of Canada, and we wouldn't want to let it come into BC. Once a species is in, it can spread across the country, and the climate can change and conditions can change. So I thought I'll just point out that we are responsible for protecting all of Canada. So we consider all the growing zones of Canada when we're making a determination. So we'll look a little bit more closely at just those species right now that are considered to be absent from Canada. So these 4 species, we have the Asphodelus fistulosus. This was found in the United States. It was found as a soybean contaminant. It's regulated in many U.S. states. It's considered to be a weed of pastures, of orchards, and fields. It's not currently regulated in Canada, but when the U.S. found it as a soybean contaminant on incoming product, because it's not regulated here in Canada yet, the United States asked the CFIA if they could direct that shipment to, if it could be diverted here to Canada. They let us know that they had found this pest, this invasive plant in it, and that triggered a very quick categorization for us. Based on what we found, we did find that it had the potential to be invasive here, so we declined the shipment, and now we're looking at that species more closely to determine if it should be added to the regulated pest list or not. The Bryonia alba, that is a serious pest in the Pacific Northwest. It's regulated in Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. It's considered to be an aggressive, fast-growing vine. It produces thick mats, and it's been compared to kudzu. It's also known to be toxic to humans and to livestock. The main pathway for that is through the ornamental trade, and it also has uses as a medicinal plant. So again, that one, looking at the zone that it could be hardy to, zone 4, that is a species that we're looking at quite closely for regulation for Canada. The Mediterranean marigold, that one is not regulated in the U.S. It does have some minor horticultural interest. It's mainly considered an agricultural pest based on the information that we've been able to find to date. The Cordaderia jubata, the pink pampas grass, it's not regulated yet in the United States as a federally regulated species, but there is some state regulation. In the U.S., it's considered to be a high concern, so they highlighted the species to us, and we're having a closer look at it as well. We move to the next set of species where we have very limited evidence of these species being available in the Canadian horticultural trade. I'll just highlight 3 species here. The Asiatic pennywort. The main use for this plant is as a medicinal plant or a vegetable. It's widely reported as a weed in its native range, mainly as an agricultural pest. Not currently regulated in the United States, but we are looking at it possible regulation for Canada. And then we have two pampas grasses where we have some evidence that they might have been available in some catalogs in Canada. The Cordaderia richardi is a serious weed in Tasmania. In a zone in Tasmania that matches potential zone range in Canada. So we think there would be some concern in Canada in coastal areas for this plant. The Cordaderia celoana, again, there is similar concern. It would be a concern in some coastal areas of Canada. So we're looking at these for regulation. A decision hasn't been made yet. And again, we would be going out for public consultation and asking for feedback on these species before they would be added to a regulated pest list. If we look at the 2 species that I've chosen to highlight that are more commonly available in the Canadian horticultural trade, chocolate vine and porcelain berry. We know that these have been offered for sale in Canada, that there is some interest in continuing to be able to sell these, but because of some of the characteristics of these plants, we are doing a risk assessment on them, and then would consider should we be adding them to the regulated pest list or not. Sometimes the decision after a risk assessment is these are not good candidates for regulation. So we'll have to take a look at all the information available to us and then come up with the best recommendation. So the chocolate vine, this is not regulated in the U.S. It's a potential forest invader, and the seeds are readily dispersed by birds, which is something that we'll have to consider when we're looking at regulation of this. The porcelain berry, it's currently prohibited in Massachusetts, in Wisconsin, and New York. It's considered to be a forest invasive, and it's also an alternate host for some regulated pests that we already have on the regulated pest list in Canada. For example, Pierce's disease, Lobesia botryana, which is the grapevine moth, and some others as well. So with this one, we'll be looking at the invasive potential, but also the fact that it could be an alternate host for some pests that we're concerned about as well. Finally, if we look at the two species that we're considering looking at for regulation, that we know these have been introduced into Canada, but they're not considered to be widely distributed as of yet in Canada. So the Aralia alata, the Japanese angelica tree, it shows up in the records as having been introduced into Ontario, but there's some uncertainty around the current status. We do know that it's naturalized in some U.S. states. It's prohibited in New York State. It's considered to be a forest invader. It can produce really dense thickets. It has very prickly stems. The birds disperse these seeds, and it produces suckers. So it has been compared to buckthorn by some. The slender false brome is a perennial grass. We do know there are two localized populations in Canada, one in Ontario and one in British Columbia. This is a species where the Ministry of Natural Resources did notify CFI of a population in Ontario. And that's when we started to have a look at that. It's currently regulated in Washington, Oregon, and California. It is available as an ornamental, but it's not a common ornamental. So we'll be conferring with our colleagues in the Pacific Northwest to determine what kind of impact it's having in the U.S. Before we would make a recommendation for regulation or for not regulating here in Canada. So those are some of the species that we're currently assessing for regulation. I thought it might be of interest to the group to find out what else we're working on at the CFIA. We have currently an e-commerce project that we're working on. We know that e-commerce is a growing field of concern. You know, having packages mailed to your door is not new. However, the internet and the ability to search from all over the world and access things from all over the world with the click of a button has really changed the volume of goods moving through the mail directly into people's homes. And because seeds are so small, it's really easy to import seeds from anywhere, new species into Canada, and have them planted into Canada really quickly. This poses an increasing biosecurity risk to Canada. And when we looked at this, we found, there was a lack of knowledge about plant health regulation. I think many, if you can find it on the internet, they're not aware that just because you can buy something, maybe you shouldn't be buying invasive plant species or the seeds. You might not even realize that they're invasive plants. There's a lot of misidentification of traded species. So people are ordering what they think is one thing and they're ending up with something else. Or they're ending up with the thing that they had ordered with a hitchhiker as well. There's a lot of free trading and sharing sites. And there's some jurisdictional limitations to what can be put into place. So e-commerce sales, they really, it represents a lot of income for retailers as well. So we have to, the value of e-commerce to the national economy is undeniable. In 2016, Canadian retailers' e-commerce sales totaled $12.5 billion. So this is a really vast undertaking to start looking at the e-commerce pathway for CFIA. We did do a pilot project just from July to September 2017. We started looking at what's available online and what might be coming into Canada. Two trends were noted from that. We noted that sellers often indicated they didn't ship to certain countries For example, they might say they don't ship to Australia or the UK due to restrictions, but often didn't exclude Canada. And there was a lot of sellers frequently misspelling or not using scientific names, and they would use a variety of common names. So we did do a search of many of the common e-commerce sites, and we found over 100 instances where you could easily acquire some of the prohibited or restricted species. You could easily access daughters, Chinese yam, which is on our regulated pest list, kudzu, silverleaf nightshade, which is another species that we have on our regulated pest list. And in addition to invasive plants, many sites are offering things like some of the regulated prohibited snails. That's very common. People like to trade snails as well. We found that the majority for invasive plant sales were coming from China, the US, and Indonesia. And there are many sites available for enthusiasts to acquire specimens. So what are we doing about this? The key to this, we really feel, is education and awareness. We can't monitor everybody's internet sales, but we really need a good education and awareness program. I think the more people would be aware that they could be bringing invasive plants into the country and that there are prohibitions and restrictions on these things, I think many people would stop ordering these invasive plants online. So we want to target some of the key e-commerce service providers to get that education and awareness program going to increase compliance and pre-border protection. So if we don't have these things arriving at our border, that's the best way. We also want to make sure that we inform Canadian importers and exporters of invasive pests, import regulations and requirements in Canada. There is a program in place. There's a quad working group. So the quad countries are Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. So we're working closely with those other countries to try and get a project up and running for e-commerce. For example, if we've been notified by Australia that they have species moving into their country from Canada from particular websites, then the CFIA can contact the exporter that exists in Canada and inform them of the Australian regulations and have them remove those items that are prohibited from moving into Australia. Similarly, we've had some instances where there have been shipments that we know started in Australia, and then we can work with the Australian government and they can talk to the exporters in Australia. So we are doing some monitoring of the e-commerce trade. It's a risk-based monitoring program. We can't, as I said before, we can't look at everything. But in addition to that, we do follow up on any complaints received as well. If somebody notifies the CFIA that they've seen things for sale on the internet that show like they're being shipped to Canada that they know shouldn't be shipped to Canada, we can follow up on that. And this has occurred. It occurs on a fairly regular basis. And generally, when we contact the exporters and let them know that they shouldn't be offering these things for sale, they quickly comply and take those offerings down. We also have a new CFI webpage dedicated to e-commerce to try and increase that education and awareness. So on our CFI site, we have a campaign for import and distribution of invasive species through the e-commerce pathway. So as I mentioned, getting the word out and getting people educated is you get a good bang for your buck that way. One of the other things we're working on is looking at sea containers and cargo. Sea containers and cargo can carry plant pests to North America. We might find clumps of soil that can have seeds in them There could be insects in the containers, on the containers. We get millions of these containers coming to Canada every year, and the risk is increasing due to globalization and access to international markets. So these shipping containers are used between many countries and for many different commodities, and they can become contaminated. Pests can hitchhike on sea containers and then move globally. So contaminated containers can enter the U.S. and Canada. They do enter every day, and then they can be transported further by rail and truck. So in 2015, in the U.S., over 12 million containers made entry through 89 ports. These commodities that they're carrying, so sometimes they could be carrying loads of pipe, or they could be carrying tools or nails. These aren't plant commodities in and of themselves, so that the commodity might not be regulated under the Plant Protection Act, but they could be contaminated with insects or weed seeds, and those things are regulated under the Plant Protection Act. We look at the types of plant pests that we detected on containers and cargo moving through Canada. So we did a 2-year survey of what are the various things that might be found. We can see that there's all different types of cargo where we noted plant pests on, and only one of these is plants and plant products. So I've mentioned there's all types of various things that we might find plant pests on. But you'll see the bar in green, the portion of the bar that's in green here, that's where we found invasive plants, either generally in seed form when we're finding things as hitchhikers or contaminants. So the vast majority of the plant pests that we're finding as a contaminant are invasive plants on cargo and containers moving. We also find insects in soil and mollusks and fungi, but as I said, the vast majority are invasive plants. So again, we're finding these things. What are we doing about it? So we do have a North American sea container initiative. We're working, Canada and the United States, working very closely together, and also with industry. So the goal is to minimize pest movement by sea containers. And we're looking at using industry best management practices for sea container cleanliness, and then making sure that industry is aware of plant pests and are educated about plant pests so that they can adapt some of the best management practices that they already have in place to eliminate plant pests. So the objective is to have outreach programs to raise awareness about the risks, and continue to do surveillance, assess the risk, and refine the approach. So right now we have a sea container initiative, and we're looking at similar awareness and collaborative approaches for the cargo that these things are carrying, looking at developing that in the future. That brings us to the end of what I had planned to present to you this afternoon. I'd be pleased to take any questions that you might have.
All right, thank you so much, Diana. So we already have a couple questions and comments. Do one comment here about regulating plant names, that maybe we should regulate plant names that nursery suppliers are allowed to use so that they're consistent and not able to misrepresent them as something else.
One thing that we do require when people are importing plants on their import permits, generally people need an import permit to bring plants into the country. So on those documents, we do require the scientific name to be used so that there's no confusion about what they're bringing in. Where we have some concerns is on foreign websites, if people are homeowners, they just, because they're using common names or sometimes misrepresenting things, that's where we can get into problems where people really just don't know what they're bringing in. And for a regulatory agency, that's difficult for us to manage because we don't have jurisdiction outside of Canada. But it would be nice to be able to standardize naming conventions so people know what they're purchasing.
Definitely. How much control is there for the CFIA in terms of nursery and greenhouse products? What gets sold there?
In what respect?
In terms of what can be sold in seeds or plants?
Yeah, so if something is a federally regulated species, then it can't be sold at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it couldn't be sold in seed form or as plants. If it's not a regulated species, then the CFIA, that wouldn't be part of our purview.
Okay. And there's a question, is there any evidence of invasion in Canada that was clearly initiated from an e-commerce case?
I'm not sure I could point, like, we don't always know where the source has come from. So I don't think I could say specifically where we could point to something being brought in through e-commerce.
Mm-hmm. Question. If I see a plant that I would like to buy, can I contact CFIA to learn if it would be allowed before I buy it over the internet?
Yes, absolutely, you can do that. And that does happen. Our local inspection offices get contacted on a fairly regular basis. And that can sometimes trigger us to look at a categorization or risk assessment for that plant, and we can get an answer back.
And a question here, is there a criminal element operating or bio attack like from Russia?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Let's see, question. Are there inspectors checking and how many across the country?
Inspectors check on a regular basis, yes. So we're, plus we have our border officers, right? So Canada Border Services agencies, also, they're responsible for looking at what's coming in across the border. And then the CFIA also has inspectors. CBSA might call us in to assist them. And we're also looking at destination, final destination, to see what's come in and checking that everything that has come in should be allowed to come in. As to how many inspectors, I don't have that number right on the top of my head, sorry. But we do have inspectors across the country.
Okay. Great, thanks. If there's any more questions, you can just write them in the chat box. How large is that kudzu population that's in Ontario?
So it's on one hillside there, and it's about half an acre. Okay.
Wow, and 10 years to remove it, that's unbelievable. Wow.
Yeah, because of the nature of the growth there. So it can reproduce both by rhizomes and by seeds. And the rhizomes, it was a fairly well-established population when we were notified of its existence. And again, because it's on that slope that's so erosion prone, we have to take a different approach than if we had found it on a flat agricultural field. So in order to make sure that that whole area doesn't just fall into Lake Erie, we have to manage it in sort of a checkerboard pattern where we actually retain some of it so the soil doesn't all wash away.
Right. A comment here, looks deliberately planted for erosion control, probably bought up from US illegally.
Yeah, again, I don't know the source of that, but I would also say that kudzu wasn't regulated in Canada until 2015. So somebody could have brought it in prior to that, and it wouldn't have been prohibited to do so.
And who can people contact at the CFIA if they do see a population of irregular pest? Is there a number they can call?
So on our website, all of our local offices have contact information there. We also have an IAS email account, our invasive alien species email account. I can provide that to you, Vicky, as well. They can contact us that way as well.
Yeah, sure. There's time for maybe one or two more questions. If there's any. Here, are all the pampas grass species regulated? I see it in a lot of places.
Yeah, so they're not currently regulated. That's the species that we're currently assessing to determine if regulation would be appropriate or not. So there's some evidence that it may be invasive, but we'll have to look and see how widespread are these things in Canada, what might be the impact, what are some of the benefits, and then once those determinations have been made, we would come out with a recommendation for regulation or not. And go out for consultation across Canada. So we are aware that some of them might have been offered as limited sales in Canada.
Mm-hmm. And how do you decide which species from all the species in the world to watch out for and assess?
Yeah, it's difficult because invasive plants are there's so many of them, and they're traded intentionally to plant in gardens, to grow as crops. So it's not like some other pests where people aren't trading them intentionally. So there are a lot, and that's where some of those initial questions come up. So can we eliminate some right away? Are they tropical and they wouldn't survive here? Well, then we don't need to have a risk assessment. We often work quite closely with the United States, and we'll conduct risk assessments together, or we'll use each other's risk assessments, and then we may be able to just incorporate some of our own challenge. Canada has different geography, different climate than the United States, but the United States may have done a lot of the literature searching already. So we may be able to work a little more quickly by not reinventing the entire risk assessment from scratch. So it is difficult, but by working collaboratively with other governments, we can try and collaboratively work and tackle it.
Mm-hmm. And another question here: how do you check containers of waste goods like clothing and garbage, etc.?
How do we check?
Like waste containers, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we're checking those directly. We're not importing a lot of waste material into Canada, and if we're importing international waste, if we get things coming from airplanes or from cruise ships. We do have actually an international waste program for those kinds of things, and they go for deep burial at specified land sites, or they go for incineration. So that would cover both plant risks and animal health concerns too. Okay.
Can you eliminate entire classes like all vines or all wetland grasses?
We haven't done that because there are some wetland grasses that might be beneficial and might really not have much of an invasive potential, especially if they're marginally hardy in Canada. So we haven't gone so far as to look at eliminating all vines or all wetland species.
Right. Okay. That pretty much wraps up the questions. So yeah, thanks so much, Diana. And
you're very welcome.
Great. And thanks everyone for tuning in, and be sure to tune in to our future webinars. All right. Have a great day.